What's something you wish your family would just admit already?
When the lights in the theater began to dim and that soft hush washed over the room, the kind that only happens in a moment people know is supposed to matter, I didn't look at the screen, or the excited faces in the front row, or even at the familiar silhouette of my best friend Miles in the back, who was already mouthing something sarcastic about the free wine. I looked at the seats I had reserved weeks ago, with name cards printed on thick ivory cardstock, centered exactly where the sight lines were best, row C, seats 5 and 6. They were empty. Completely. Not even jackets thrown across them to pretend someone might show up late. Just cold, untouched velvet cushions glowing faintly under the aisle lights. My parents didn't come. And even though I'd told everyone that I was totally fine with it, hell, I even made a joke about it during the press Q&A the day before, I wasn't fine. I was the furthest possible thing from fine, and the worst part was I knew they wouldn't even feel bad about it. It had all started 3 weeks earlier when I called to remind them about the premiere. The response wasn't angry or dramatic or even dismissive, it was something worse. It was casual. My mom had said, in the same tone she used when she declined lunch invitations, "Oh honey, I think we're gonna sit this one out. Your father's knees can't handle those tiny seats and, well, we've already been to so many ceremonies." As if I had just invited them to another middle school band recital instead of the first screening of the film I had written, directed, produced, and, yes, starred in after 15 years of crawling up the indie circuit on my hands and knees. As if this was just another thing Jenna does, not the only goddamn thing I ever wanted to be seen for. I let it go. Or I said I did. Told Miles, told Lori, told myself, it's their loss. But every day leading up to that night, I rehearsed what I would have said if they had come, if they'd shown up with those uncomfortable forced smiles, maybe handed me flowers too big for the occasion, said something like, "Well, look at our little director." And I hated how much I wanted it. Still, after all these years, the room filled. My name was printed on the glossy black tickets in white font. There was a red carpet, for Christ's sake. Local reporters. A tiny old man with a Nikon who said he'd covered the early days of Soderbergh. Lori wore this green dress she never usually brings out, the one she bought for her engagement party, but never got the chance to wear again. She came alone, her husband had work, or something like it, but she looked proud in that particular way younger siblings do when they know, without being told, that this moment isn't just about them. She held my hand for too long before the lights went out. The film started. I tried to disappear into the experience like people say you should when your work is on display, but my stomach was too tight and my skin too hot. I kept glancing toward those empty seats like they'd fill themselves out of guilt. I saw people laugh where I hoped they would. I saw one woman dab her eyes during a quiet, lingering shot of my character walking alone down a street. But mostly, I kept waiting for that final line. That closing scene. The one I added in post-production, last minute, impulsive, maybe reckless. Miles told me not to do it. Said it was a little too on the nose, and I told him so what? They never gave a damn about subtlety. And he didn't push. So here's how it went. Right before the credits, in the last minute of the film, my character looks directly into the lens, after all the messy plot lines have come full circle, after she's been abandoned, betrayed, and stripped of any remaining illusion that love means showing up. She looks into the camera, dead still, and says, to the ones who never showed up, thanks for the fuel. No music. No slow fade. Just silence. And then the screen went black. People clapped. Not a polite golf clap either, real applause. A few cheers. And even though I could feel a lump like a golf ball rising in my throat, I didn't cry. Not yet. But Lori did. I found her outside the theater, standing under one of those flickering overhead bulbs, shoulders shaking as she wiped her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. I thought at first she was just overwhelmed, maybe proud, maybe moved. But when she looked up at me, there was guilt in her face. Like she knew something she hadn't told me. They saw it, Jenna, she said, voice trembling. Not the film. The script. They saw the scene, the dinner scene. From your second draft. Mom read it. I stared at her, not sure if I was supposed to feel betrayed or vindicated or just plain stupid. She said it was too close to home, Lori continued, choking on the words. She said if you're gonna air our family business, she's not gonna sit in a room while strangers clap for it. I didn't say anything. I just stood there with my hands shoved deep into my coat pockets, like if I gripped them tight enough, I could stop myself from going back inside and screaming. The dinner scene she was talking about, that was the one I never thought they'd find. I had taken it out of the final version anyway. But the draft had leaked months earlier, probably through some shared Google Doc I forgot to clean up. In it, a daughter confronts her emotionally detached parents over 20 years of passive-aggressive control and performative love. It's brutal. It's real. And yeah, it was based on them. Almost word for word. So they knew. They knew how I saw them. And instead of showing up, instead of asking questions or even pretending to be interested in what that pain had turned into, they bowed out. Not with outrage. With indifference. And I think that might hurt worse. The camera had zoomed in. The room had gone silent. The words were said. The fuel had burned. And now, standing outside the theater, next to my crying sister and under a light that couldn't decide if it wanted to stay on or not, I realized something I hadn't let myself think until that exact moment. Maybe they were never going to show up. Not just to the film, but to me. To any version of me that wasn't safe, quiet, and grateful. And if that's true, then maybe this story wasn't revenge. Maybe it was a eulogy. It wasn't until the next morning, long after the clapping had died down, after the chairs had been stacked by tired volunteers and the paper wine cups had been swept into bags that smelled faintly of popcorn and something sourer. And after I had finally taken off the heels I swore I wouldn't wear in the first place, but did anyway because somewhere in my mind, even now, I still wanted to look put together if my parents changed their mind at the last minute. It wasn't until the next morning that I realized how much of my energy over the past 2 decades had been spent preparing for a moment that was never going to arrive. And maybe that's why, when Lori showed up on my porch without warning, wearing sunglasses despite the clouds and carrying 2 to-go coffees she clearly picked up in a rush, I already knew before she spoke that something heavier was about to be dropped into my lap. Something I had been circling around for years but hadn't wanted to name. She didn't sit at first. Just stood there awkwardly, hands wrapped too tightly around the cardboard cup, like it would keep her grounded, like she was about to tell me someone had died, and I felt a strange, bitter calm settle over me because in a way, someone had. Maybe not in flesh, but certainly in function. The version of my parents I had quietly hoped might still exist, somewhere behind the disapproving eyes and tightly wound schedules and annual Christmas cards with generic messages printed in gold foil. The ones that said warmest wishes and blessings from our family as if they were afraid to write something by hand in case it made them real. That version had finally, absolutely flatlined. Lori took a slow breath and said, "I should have told you earlier, but I didn't want to ruin the night. Or your moment. But I think you need to know why they didn't come." At first, I just raised an eyebrow, not ready to give her the satisfaction of shock, but my stomach clenched anyway because I'd already assumed it had to be something pathetic. Something stupid like traffic or a dental appointment or their inability to navigate online ticketing. But when Lori said the words, "They read the second draft," I felt something shift in my spine, like a quiet fracture forming, the kind that doesn't snap, but instead spreads over time, weakening everything around it. She explained that a few months back, after I had sent her an early version of the script for feedback, she'd mentioned it in passing to Mom, who insisted she send it over. Not because she was interested, Lori said, but because she was curious what you were working on this time. Curious, like it was a recipe or a room you were repainting. They read it. Together. She even remembered what day, Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks before Easter. Apparently, they sat on the porch with coffee and printed pages, and that same smug detachment they used to use when they read my high school essays and said things like, "interesting, but a little dramatic." Lori had tried to warn me afterward, tried to hint that they were upset, but I had been too buried in production stress to pick up on the tone. And now, in retrospect, I remembered the one-word email from my mother that came a week later, noted, and how I had laughed at the time. thinking maybe she was reacting to the blog post I'd shared about being an artist over 40. But no, it was the script. Specifically, the dinner scene. That scene, the one I had cut before the final version, but had poured more of myself into than I wanted to admit, was a quiet war zone on paper. A grown daughter sitting at a dinner table with two parents who smile through clenched teeth, who ask polite, invasive questions and offer vague approval only when it makes them look good. It ends with the daughter standing, looking at her untouched plate and saying, "I don't know what's worse, that you don't remember what you did, or that you never thought it mattered." It wasn't subtle. And it wasn't fiction. Lori looked at me then, like she was afraid I'd explode, but I didn't. I just stared past her, watching two crows fight over a crust of bread on the sidewalk, thinking about how strange it was that even birds knew how to show up when something mattered. I finally asked, "So that was enough for them to skip it? That one scene?" Lori nodded slowly, adding, "Mom said if you wanted to put your version of the past on display, she didn't want to sit there while strangers clapped for lies." Lies. That word. It echoed louder than I expected. And I almost laughed because I had spent so long trying to keep the script just fictional enough to avoid that accusation. I had changed names. I had blurred timelines. I had rewritten conversations that haunted me into something gentler, cleaner. But none of that mattered. Because they saw the truth anyway, and instead of facing it, they bolted. I sat down on the steps of the porch then, knees aching from standing too long, and said, more to myself than to Lori, they didn't skip it because it hurt. They skipped it because it forced them to remember. And that was it, wasn't it? It wasn't that they were offended. It was that they were caught. Held up to a mirror by their own daughter, and shown a version of themselves they couldn't smile through. So they did what they always did, closed the door, tightened the blinds, and pretended it didn't exist. Lori sat beside me. Her coffee had gone cold. Her voice cracked when she said, "I think she regrets it." I mean, she kept asking if you were mad. But she didn't say sorry. Just asked. And that right there was the Matthews signature move. No apologies. Just discomfort. No real conversation. Just avoidance wrapped in civility. I nodded slowly, not because I forgave them, but because there was nothing else to say. Later that night, I opened my laptop and reread that scene. The one that broke everything. The one that made them stay home. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty for writing it. I felt something sharper. Cleaner. Like I'd told a truth that was long overdue, and whether or not they wanted to hear it didn't make it any less real. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about family, sometimes. The real betrayal isn't what they did to you. It's how little they cared once you said it out loud. There's something deeply strange, almost otherworldly, about opening a box that's been sealed for more than 20 years, especially when you know that everything inside it was once given to you under the illusion of love, or worse, under the obligation of it. I hadn't planned to go digging through that mess of half-forgotten keepsakes and faded birthday cards until the idea took root like a weed during a sleepless night. I'd been pacing the living room at 2 a.m, the same loop around the couch I've been tracing since I moved into this place 7 years ago, restless and agitated in that way only old wounds can make you. When I suddenly remembered the box in the back of the hall closet, the one labeled Jenna, School and Stuff, written in my mother's all-caps handwriting, efficient and impersonal like everything else she ever put on paper. I sat cross-legged on the floor with a cup of burnt decaf and opened the cardboard lid slowly, half expecting it to smell like mildew or lost time or some bitter combination of both. Inside, as expected, were the artifacts of a girl who once tried very hard to be noticed without making anyone uncomfortable. Old report cards with comments like, "Jenna is a bright student, but can be overly emotional when corrected," participation trophies from events I didn't even remember attending, a few yellowed drawings I'd made in 2nd grade that had been preserved in those plastic sheet protectors, not because they were remarkable, but because my mother had always been good at organizing. She knew how to store things. She just didn't know how to see them. And then I found the letters. Or rather, the cards, dozens of them, stacked neatly and bundled with a stretched-out hair tie, each one from a birthday or a graduation or some holiday that had demanded a gesture. Most were blank inside, except for the same 4 words scribbled over and over, love, mom and dad. No personal notes, no memories referenced, no inside jokes or silly anecdotes, just those 4 words, repeated like a stamp, like a line on a form. I read them all, every last one, and as I reached the bottom of the stack, something inside me, something that had once felt like longing, but had since hardened into something more jagged, finally cracked. I called Miles around 4 in the morning, not because I expected him to pick up, but because I needed to say the words out loud to someone, even if it was just to voicemail. I think I've spent my whole damn life trying to make them clap for me once, I said, voice raw and shaking. Just once. Just once where it wasn't forced or expected or because other people were watching. I think I needed it more than I realized. And now I feel like an idiot for even hoping. The next morning, I woke up to a text from him that said, "Then make them hear you louder." I didn't respond, but I knew exactly what he meant. The film had already made an impact, modest but real. A few reviewers had mentioned it on blogs, and one had even called my performance arresting in its stillness, whatever that meant. But the biggest news came in the form of a terse, businesslike email from a small but reputable indie distributor. They wanted to screen the film at a national showcase in Austin, part of a curated program about family narratives and generational silence. I stared at the screen for a long time before forwarding the message to Miles with a single line, "Looks like they'll be clapping now." But that wasn't the real moment. That came 2 days later, when I found myself rewriting the final scene of the film, not the one that had already aired, not the "thanks for the fuel" line, which had become its own strange little meme in the local arts community, but a new scene. One that I planned to film as a bonus feature for the showcase version, raw and stripped down. It was based entirely on one of those birthday cards. The scene would open with the character reading a card in silence, the words love, mom and dad visible but not spoken, and then sitting in a room alone, surrounded by every item she'd ever been given in place of affection, trophies, awards, carefully labeled folders, and one by one, she'd start throwing them into a fireplace. No words, no music. Just the sound of burning. Miles didn't like it. He thought it was too blunt, too heavy-handed. "You've already said what you needed to say," he argued. "You already cut them once. Are you trying to bleed them dry now?" But what he didn't understand, what I don't think anyone could unless they'd lived it, was that this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about the archaeology of neglect. About finally saying, without shame or filter, that being remembered isn't the same as being seen, and being loved isn't the same as being known. I didn't tell Lori about the new scene. She had started texting more often, checking in with that polite guilt that made it clear she was walking a tightrope between our parents' discomfort and my simmering rage. She kept saying things like, "They're trying in their own way, and you know how they are," which only made me feel more isolated. Because I did know how they were. That was the problem. I knew it too well, and I was finally done pretending that knowledge was something I could live peacefully with. The truth was, the silence in those cards, the empty gestures bundled in hair ties and stored in closets, had done more damage than 1,000 cruel words ever could. Because they taught me to equate love with absence, praise with conditions, and memory with obligation. And no matter how many films I made, no matter how many theaters filled or critics praised or distributors signed on, that silence was still in me, like a second bloodstream. But maybe, just maybe, if I burned it loud enough, someone else would hear it too. And maybe they'd know they weren't alone. It came without warning, like most things from them did, not with any meaningful build-up or genuine attempt to reconnect, but with a short, sterile email written in a way that sounded more like a memo from a middle manager than a message from someone who was supposed to be, at least on paper, my father. It landed in my inbox at 7:22 in the morning on a Tuesday, which meant he probably sent it just before walking out to grab the newspaper in his slippers and mutter something judgmental about the neighbors. Same way he had every day since I was 12. The subject line said nothing literally, it was blank, and the body of the message was only 10 words long. "We saw the clip. We'd like to talk. Dad." No greeting. No apology. Not even my name. Just a sentence that carried the weight of 1,000 absences and the kind of careful detachment that made me feel, all over again, like a project he didn't quite understand but didn't want to be accused of ignoring entirely. I didn't reply, not at first. I just stared at the screen, coffee going cold in my hands, and thought about all the other messages I'd composed over the years, but never sent. Messages filled with truths too raw, too vulnerable, too humiliating to put out into the world, even in the quiet of a private inbox. I remembered the email I'd drafted the night I didn't get into NYU film school, the one I wrote with shaking hands and tear-streaked cheeks where I begged them to tell me they were proud of me anyway, even if the letter said no. I remembered the text I typed but deleted after my first real breakup, when I sat on the floor of my bathroom wondering if anyone who had raised me could explain why I always fell for people who couldn't love me back. And now, after all that silence, I got 10 words from him, after watching me deliver a monologue in front of a crowd where I all but called them out on emotional neglect. And they wanted to talk. I forwarded the message to Miles, who immediately called me, his voice thick with that familiar mix of protective sarcasm and sincere concern that made him one of the only people I trusted anymore. "So what's the plan?" he asked. "Gonna give them a second screening? Maybe this time they'll bring popcorn." I didn't laugh. Not because it wasn't funny, because it was, in a sad, knife-twisting kind of way, but because I had already started writing something else. A second script. A new story. One that wasn't a cry for recognition, not anymore, but a calculated, unapologetic dissection of the ways love can be used like a leash, tight enough to control you, loose enough to make you think you're free. I told Miles I wasn't going to meet them. Not yet. That I had better things to do, like build something they couldn't ignore, a narrative too sharp to dismiss as just another artsy expression. He said I sounded like I was halfway to becoming a villain in my own story, and maybe he was right, but at that point, I didn't care. There's a certain satisfaction, a terrible and exhilarating satisfaction, in finally realizing you no longer crave the approval of the people who've used it like a weapon your entire life. But the truth, which I didn't say out loud, was that part of me did want to meet them, not because I needed closure, not even because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted to look them in the eye while I still could and see, with my own face, whether they had even a flicker of remorse behind those practiced smiles. I wanted to know if they'd show up to the table like adults or arrive armored in their usual passive-aggressive armor, ready to redirect the blame onto my interpretation of events, as if memory were a dirty trick I'd pulled on them for dramatic effect. Lori, predictably, found out about the email before I told her. She called me that evening and said, in that tight, careful tone she always used when she was trying to keep everyone from imploding, "They're trying, Jenna. Maybe not in the way you want, but it's something." I almost hung up right there, because that sentence, "they're trying," was the same one I'd heard 1,000 times over the years, the one that excused every absence, every cold glance, every backhanded compliment dressed as encouragement. But instead, I said, slowly and clearly, trying would have meant showing up without needing to be the hero. Trying would have meant facing the film without flinching. And Lori, to her credit, didn't argue. She just said, "They don't know how to do this," and I replied, "Then they shouldn't have raised a daughter who did." A few nights later, after too many hours of pacing and rewriting the same scene 3 times, I finally made the decision. If I was going to meet them, it would be on my terms. Not in their house, which still smelled like lavender soap and emotional avoidance, and not at a restaurant where they could smile through their discomfort while tipping too much out of guilt. I chose the old diner, the one off Route 36 that we used to go to after church when I was a kid, the place where I used to order pancakes even at night because it was the only time I could choose something sweet without being judged for it. I sent the location to my father's email with a single line, "Sunday at 2. If you're late, I leave." No signature. No explanation. Just that. Miles said it was theatrical. Lori said it was a mistake. But I knew what I was doing. I wasn't staging a reunion. I was setting the scene. Because if they wanted a conversation, they were going to get one. But not the kind they were expecting. Not the kind that ends in hugs or apologies or anything tied up with a neat little bow. I had a story to finish, and they were going to sit through it, every uncomfortable, ugly minute of it. And this time, they wouldn't get to leave early. The day of the meeting arrived like a storm you'd seen coming from miles away, but still weren't ready for when it finally hit, and although I had told myself 1,000 times in the week leading up to it that I felt nothing, that whatever version of grief or anger or anticipation that once lived inside me had been drained dry, I still found myself wide awake at 6 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of a garbage truck down the block, as if the city were mocking me by cleaning up its trash while I prepared to wade back into mine. I didn't dress up for them, not exactly, but I didn't go casual either. Instead, I chose the kind of outfit that says, without needing to say it, that I have built a life they weren't invited to, a life that no longer bends in the direction of their approval. And yet, despite all the rehearsals I'd done in my mind, imagining how I would sit, how I would speak, how I would hold eye contact just long enough to unnerve them, I still felt the familiar pull in my chest as I parked outside that diner, the same cracked parking lot with the faded "Open 24 hours" sign blinking its lie above the chipped glass windows. They were already inside when I arrived, which surprised me more than I wanted to admit, sitting stiffly in a booth that faced the door, like they wanted the high ground in a war they didn't even know they'd already lost. My father looked older than I remembered, his jaw more sunken, his hair whiter, but his posture was still as upright as it had been the last time we'd spoken in person, which had been almost a year ago at Laurie's birthday, where he told me, between bites of dry cake, that he just didn't get why people needed to make everything public these days. My mother, by contrast, looked exactly the same, neat, controlled, her blouse tucked in with surgical precision, her eyes scanning me not with warmth, but with evaluation, as if to silently determine whether this meeting would damage their reputation or redeem it. I slid into the booth without saying a word, and for a long moment, the three of us sat there in silence, the air between us thick with everything that hadn't been said in decades. The waitress came and went, dropping off water with a smile too wide for the atmosphere, and it wasn't until she disappeared that my father finally cleared his throat and said, "We watched the video clip from the premiere." His voice was measured, careful, the kind of tone you use when trying to talk down a stranger's barking dog. "We didn't realize, at the time, how much it meant to you." I wanted to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so pathetic, so perfectly on brand for them to come into this space, this moment, and still think the issue was about not understanding the importance of the event. As if what I was grieving was a missed milestone, and not a lifetime of silence. I didn't respond. I simply reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and opened the recording from that night, the one a friend had taken from the third row. The camera zoomed in just as I delivered the final line, the line that had echoed through that auditorium like a funeral bell. To the ones who never showed up, I said again, this time across the sticky surface of a diner table, "Thanks for the fuel." My mother flinched. Barely, but I saw it, the tightening of her lips, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the table, white-knuckled and trembling. My father looked down at his glass of water as if it might offer him an exit. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity, and then, finally, my mother said, "We didn't think it was about us." That sentence, that one absurd, delusional sentence, nearly broke whatever restraint I had left, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself feel the full weight of what I had carried. Not just the disappointment, not just the anger, but the deep, bottomless absurdity of loving people who have spent their entire lives pretending they didn't know why you were hurting. I leaned forward, not to intimidate, but to make sure they heard every word. "You didn't think it was about you," I repeated, slowly, deliberately, because it was easier to believe I made it up than to admit you were the ones who never looked when I was drowning. My father's eyes were still fixed on his water, and my mother's face had gone tight with the kind of shame she would never admit to but couldn't fully hide. "You think this is about a movie," I continued, my voice quiet, but sharp enough to cut glass, but the film was never the point. The film was the scream I had to craft with my bare hands, because every time I asked to be seen, you told me I was overreacting. There was no argument, no defensive outburst, not even a tear, just that same suffocating stillness I remembered from childhood dinners, the kind that followed any conversation that strayed too close to the truth. I stood up slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle like dust around us. "You want to talk?" I said, stepping back from the table. Here's the only thing I'll say. I spent 30 years trying to earn a sentence from you. One sentence. And the first time you write to me in months, it's because I made a room full of strangers clap. I left them there in that booth, staring at the space I had occupied, as if expecting me to come back and finish whatever performance they thought I was delivering. But there was no performance. Not anymore. There was only clarity. Cold, bright, irreversible clarity. Later that night, I sat at my desk, the second script still open on the screen, the title bold and unflinching, Fuel. I didn't write anything new. I just stared at the page, at the blinking cursor, at the silence that now, finally, belonged to me and no one else. Lori called. I didn't answer. Her voicemail was short, but it said everything I already knew was coming. They said you humiliated them. I think Mom's crying. Was it worth it? And for a moment, just a moment, I didn't know what to say. Because how do you measure the worth of a wound finally named? How do you quantify the cost of a truth spoken too late? I closed the laptop and sat back, staring at the ceiling. No music. No applause. No camera. Just the echo of my own voice in a room no longer waiting for theirs. I don't know if they're proud of me now. I don't know if they ever were. But I know they heard me. And this time, they couldn't leave.